Hello and welcome to How to Wargame. I am Ardwulf, and this is episode 3 featuring Paths of Glory from GMT Games and designer Ted Rasier. This episode we're going to talk about Paths of Glory's action phase. This phase contains the bulk of the gameplay, so we're going to cover playing strategy cards, movement, combat, and a number of minor things that are tied into those. Before we start, I should again mention that the videos in this series are fairly dense, so feel free to pause and rewind if you need to. If you have a copy of the game, you can follow along with the physical pieces or follow along with Vassal if you have that module. If you need an introduction to Vassal or don't know what it is, then I have a video on that, so check out the channel. Let's start our discussion of the action phase by briefly looking at the strategy card decks again. Paths of Glory has two decks, one for the allies and one for the central powers. When the game starts, both players are at the war commitment level of mobilization, and so only these mobilization cards are in the decks. When one side reaches limited war during the check of war commitment level during the war status phase, we will shuffle the limited war cards into that respective player's deck, and the same thing happens when that player reaches total war. Now, it is possible, and by design, that one player might have the limited war or even total war cards in their deck, and the other player only has limited war or mobilization, so the two decks can be different sizes. During game setup, each side will draw 7 cards. Hand size will remain at 7 for the duration of the game. In each draw strategy card phase, both players will draw new cards up to 7 to fill their hands. During each action phase, each player is going to take 6 actions, with the Central Powers player playing first, the allies playing second, and alternating until the final card play by the allies. There is also an optional rule that gives you a hand size of 8, but if you use this rule, you'll still only take 6 actions per turn. Each pair of card plays is called an action round. One action by the Central Powers and one by the allies in that order. You cannot pass. You have to take an action, but you don't necessarily have to play a card. There are 6 actions you can perform when your turn comes up. First, you can play a strategy card as an operations card. This means that you will get ops points to spend equal to the value on the card, and that is this large number in the upper left-hand corner. We will talk about this in detail shortly. Second, you can play a strategy card for its event. If you do this, the event on the card takes effect, but you don't get ops points or anything else unless the card text says so, and some cards do. For example, the Cloak and Dagger card, you execute the event on the card. The allied player can examine cards in the Central Powers player's hands, but then you spend operations points using this card, which means you spend its ops value of 2. So you have 2 operations points to spend. Some card events have an effect that stays active for the rest of the game or until countered by another card. So for example, Moltke here has an effect that stays in play until the Central Powers player plays the Falkenhayn card. In general, though, you can just follow the instructions on the card and they're pretty easy and straightforward. Reinforcement cards like this one are played as events. Some cards have an asterisk next to the title of the event on the card. The asterisk means that if this card is played as an event, it is removed permanently from the game. If a card event has a parenthesized number next to its name, then that number is added to that power's war status score as the event is played. Some cards have a red CC next to the event name. This means that this is a combat card and its event can be played during combat, although the card can be played for other stuff as well. Third, you can play a strategy card as a strategic redeployment card. This gives you strategic redeployment points equal to the SR value on the card. That number is the small number in the upper left-hand corner. Fourth, you can play a strategy card for replacements. This gives you replacement points for each country that you mark on the general records track. You can spend these replacement points during the replacement phase to restore reduced units to full strength and rebuild destroyed units. We will talk about replacements and reinforcements in full in the next episode. Fifth, you can offer peace terms if your victory point level is within the allowable range. My understanding is that this action is rarely used, but we will discuss it in a later episode. Sixth and last, you can choose not to play a card and take an automatic operation which gives you 1 ops point. You can do this if you're out of cards or if you just want to hold a card for later. When you play a card for its operations points, you receive activation points equal to the ops value on the card. So if the blockade card here was played for the ops points, the player would get 4 ops points, whereas if the Race to the Sea card is played by the Central Powers player, the Central Powers player would get 3 ops points. You can spend these points by activating spaces on the map. It's important to note that you don't activate units, you activate spaces. When you pay the cost to activate, every unit in that space is activated. You cannot activate only some of the units in the space. You don't have to actually move or attack with all the units in the activated space, however. When you activate a space, you activate it for either movement or combat, not for both. And you allocate all of your activations, then execute movement, then execute combat. That order is very important. Your allocations can be marked with these tokens. So if we activated the space here in Sedan for movement, we would mark it with a move. And if we activated the space Up here, we would mark it for attack. The cost to activate a space in ops points is 1 point per nationality present in that space. So a space containing 1 British and 1 French army, like the space here in Sedan, would cost 2 points to activate. And again, you cannot partially activate the space. You have to pay the 2 points or you can't activate the space at all. Whereas this space here in Amiens with 2 French armies would cost only 1 point to activate because there is only 1 nationality present there. Now, there are a whole bunch of special exceptions to this activation cost rule. For one thing, Belgian units in Antwerp, Ostend, Calais, or Amiens can be treated as British units for activation purposes. So you could activate the British units here in Antwerp and the Belgians as British and only pay 1 ops point. French and American units in the same space can be activated together as 1 nationality, but only in spaces in France or Germany. Now, some event cards can modify the activation cost. For example, the Central Powers cards, Sud Army and 11th Army, do allow some Central Powers stacks of different nationalities to be treated as 1 nationality for activation. And again, just follow the instructions on the card. Also, British Empire units like the ANA, BR, Australian, Canadian, and Portuguese units are treated as British units. So here is the British-Portuguese unit, and for activation purposes, it's treated as a British unit. Similarly, the SN unit, which comes into play in the Middle East map, which we will talk about in the last episode of this series, is activated as a Turkish unit. So these units are the same color as the Turkish units, and these are the same color as the British units, and that's how you tell. As in many, if not most, war games, each space on the Paths of Glory map has a stacking limit. This is the maximum number of units that you can stack in that space, and units over that total are eliminated. Now, the stacking limit in Paths of Glory is 3 combat units of whatever size. Forts and trenches do not count against stacking. Stacking limits are in effect at all times, but we have to check it at the end of any movement, including regular movement, strategic redeployment, and advancing after combat. Units are allowed to exceed the stacking limit while they're moving, but they're not allowed to end their movement overstacked. So, for example, this space in Brussels containing 3 French armies is at the stacking limit of 3, so it is fine. It is not overstacked. However, this stack in Verdun is over the stacking limit. There is an army and 3 corps and a trench, and even though the trench doesn't count, there are 4 combat units in this stack. So in this example, the Central Powers player would choose which units to eliminate due to overstacking, and obviously the Central Powers player would choose the army to eliminate. And you can't just flip it because then there's still 4 combat units there. Overstacking is a truly Bush League move in a game like this where the stacking limit is just a number of combat units. In other games, stacking is substantially more complicated and it's much easier to slip up. In Paths of Glory, it's probably not going to happen. After all of your ops have been spent and you've activated all the spaces that you can perform your movement action. When a space activates for movement, you can choose to move any or all of the units in that space, either one at a time or stacked together. The third number on the unit counter is its movement rate, which is the number of spaces it can move. Most units in Paths of Glory have a movement rate of 3. Many corps have a movement rate of 4. Now, all movement happens along these lines that connect spaces, and 2 spaces that are connected by one of these lines are said to be adjacent. Some spaces are connected by these dotted lines. The dotted line indicates that there is some kind of national limitation on which units can move or attack across this line. So in this case, only RU Russian units can move or attack across this line between Uman and the Caucasus. Units can move through a space that's been activated for combat, but they cannot end their movement there. So you cannot activate a space for combat and then load it up with new units with move actions before the fighting. This is to reflect the relatively high level of preparation that had to go into large-scale attacks in World War I. So in the context of movement, let's talk about entrenchments, because building defensive trenches in a space is a movement action. Now, trenches are distinct from forts, which we will talk about in episode 4. In any space that's been activated for movement, you could declare that an army is entrenching instead of actually moving. Now, only armies can entrench, not corps, but corps benefit from existing entrenchments just like armies do. To build or improve a trench, you roll 1 die. If you roll the entrenching army's loss factor or less, the entrenchment is successful. So if the roll succeeds, you add your side's level 1 entrenchment marker to that space, or if there's already a level 1 trench there, flip it to level 2. So let's say we've activated Nancy here for a movement. What we could do in executing that movement action is move 1 army out and then declare that the other army is entrenching, and then we roll a die and we try to roll under the loss factor. The loss factor is, again, the middle number on the counter. We'll get back to that because that's going to be important this episode. So if we roll 3 or less in this case, then the entrenchment is successful, and we would place a level 1 entrenchment marker on this space. If there is already a level 1 trench marker there, then we will flip that trench marker to level 2. Now, entrenchments can also be captured. If your army moves into a space that contains an enemy entrenchment, you reduce the entrenchment level by 1 and replace it with your own trench marker. So if the space has a level 2 trench in it, you replace it with your own level 1 marker, and if it has a level 1 trench, you remove the trench totally, and the space is no longer entrenched. So in our running example here, If there's a combat and the forces in Nancy are forced to retreat, and these German forces move in, then we remove this Allied level 2 trench and replace it with a level 1 Central Powers trench. Now, there is still a fort in this space, and until that fort is destroyed, that fort is still there. So, finally, let's talk about combat. Now, combat in Paths of Glory is basically pretty simple. You add up the combat factors on each side rolls a die on one of 2 combat tables, and you inflict losses on the other side as specified by the table. So, there is a 14-point combat sequence of play, which we will talk about very briefly later. Don't be intimidated by that. It's sort of scary looking, but after about 2 game turns playing through these combats, you will understand it. However, there are a bunch of wrinkles to it, so I'm going to delve into every major aspect of the combat process and then sum up with talking about that sequence of combat. You conduct all combats after all movement has been completed, and the spaces that you activated for attack can participate. They are not, however, obligated to. In fact, you can decide at this point to not have any battles at all and everybody goes home, although this is a waste of activations. You also don't have to declare the hexes that you're actually attacking until the combat itself starts. You only have to declare the spaces that you're activating for attack. Any one unit can only attack one target space, but multiple attacking spaces can target a single defending space. We'll get into that with our example. Multiple units in the same attacking space can attack different targets. The attacker, that is the phasing player, the player whose turn it is in the action round, determines which combats occur in what order. To conduct the attack, you add up the combat factors of all the attacking spaces and add up the combat factors of all the defending spaces. If there is a fort in the space, don't forget to add the fort's combat factor to the defender's total. Now, personally, I forget to do this pretty regularly. So in the case of our attacking space here, we have 3 attacking spaces, all adjacent to the French-held space of Sedan. In Sedan, we have 1 French army worth 3 combat factors and 1 corps worth 1 combat factor. So in defense, there is a total of 4 combat factors, whereas attacking, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 German armies worth 5 each. So we have 25 factors in attack. Once the combat strength for each side is added up, either side can play combat cards, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, but combat cards can provide a modifier to the die roll or negate the defender's terrain advantages or trench advantage. The attacker can also try to flank the defender if the attack is coming from more than one space, and we'll talk about that shortly. Paths of Glory has 2 different combat tables, one for armies and one for corps. As long as a side has at least 1 army involved in the combat, you use the army table, and if a side only has corps, then you use the corps table. You'll notice the corps table has smaller numbers as a result. We'll get into what that means. There can be modifiers to the die roll from combat cards, and there can be column shifts from terrain, and we'll get into a little bit of that this episode, but we'll talk about terrain and terrain effects a little bit more next episode. So each side rolls a die on a column representing its combat strengths. Cross-referencing this with the die roll gives you a number. This number is the loss number that each side inflicts on the other side. Normally, combat is simultaneous. Both players roll at the same time and deal losses to the other at the same time. Flank attacks are the exception to this, but again, we'll talk about that in a minute. So in our example, we have 1 French army defending and 1 French corps defending. So the French will use the army table, and the Germans only have armies attacking, so they will use the army table as well. Now the French are going to roll on the 4 column because they have 4 columns defending, whereas the Germans are going to roll on 16 plus because they have 25 factors in the attack. Let's say that these are our example rolls. The blue die represents the French player, and the French player has rolled a 5. So on the 4 column, a roll of 5 will result in 4 loss factors, whereas the German has rolled a 4, and on the 16 plus column, that represents a loss value of 7 factors. So think of these loss numbers as damage points that one side has done to the other side. So the loss number is the amount of quote-unquote damage that one side has inflicted on the other. This can reduce or destroy units on both sides. Each unit can absorb its loss factor in damage before being reduced. And again, if you recall, the loss factor of a unit is the middle number on the counter. Now the owner of the unit decides where to take the loss, but if he can take a loss, he has to. And there are certain units that have to take losses before others. The BEF here is one of them. If the BEF is involved in the attack, then they are leading the battle, as it were, and need to take losses first. After taking the first loss, there may be points left over, so we allocate those as well in the same way. So let's take again a look at our rolling example here. In this example, the Germans have dealt 7 loss factors to the French, while the French have dealt 4 to the Germans. So technically the defender takes his losses first, but it doesn't really matter because combat is simultaneous since there was no flank attack here. Now each of the German units can absorb 3 damage before it is forced to take a retreat. The French did 4, so we're going to have to take a loss here. So for example, we can flip a unit in any of these spaces. So to take the loss, we just flip this unit. Okay, and then we will have 1 loss factor left. Now, every unit here still has a loss factor of 3, so there's not going to be enough to do a second hit to the Germans. So we still have to absorb our 7 combat losses as the French. And here is one example of a way we can do that. And remember, we have to take losses if we're able to take losses. So we have 7 that we have to allocate. So we can, for example, reduce the French Fifth Army by 1 step for 3. So at this point we have 4 left over. We can reduce the French Fifth Army by an additional step for another 3, and we will replace it at that time with a full-strength French corps. And at this point, we have 1 loss factor left, so we will reduce one of the 2 corps by 1 step as well, and we will flip it to its reduced strength side. Now, if there is a fort in the defending space, it will always take losses last, and if the attacker then moves into the space via an advance, he can place the fort under siege, in which case we put a besieged marker on it. So let's say the Germans cause this French corps in Belfort to retreat or eliminate it and advance into that space. Assuming they have not destroyed the fort via the combat, the army is eligible to place the fort under siege, so we will place a besieged marker on it to remind us to talk about that during the siege phase. And again, we'll talk about siege in episode 4. The side that inflicted the higher loss number on its opponent is the winner of the battle. This is important for determining retreats and the fate of any combat cards that were played. Now, if the 2 sides deal the same loss number, then both sides lose, and that's also important. If the attacker is the winner of the combat, then any surviving defending units have to retreat. If the attacker won by only 1 loss number, then the defender retreats 1 space, whereas if the attacker won by more than 1, then the defender must retreat 2 spaces. The attacker never has to retreat. Some terrain and all trenches, but not forts, give the defender the option to take an extra step loss instead of retreating. This is all summarized on the terrain effects chart, which we'll look at more closely in episode 4. The defender cannot retreat back into the original defending space and can't enter any space containing enemy units or an enemy fort unless that fort is besieged, but other than that, any retreat has to move into a friendly space first, but the stacking limit has to be obeyed at the end of the retreat, not necessarily during the retreat. So a destination space that is already at the stacking limit can be retreated through, but not into. Multiple retreating units can retreat to different destination spaces. If there are multiple legal spaces that you can retreat into, then you first have to retreat into a friendly space that's in supply, and then if none of those are available, you can retreat into a friendly space that's not in supply, followed by an enemy space, obviously, that doesn't contain any enemy units. If it's a multi-space retreat, then after retreating the first space, you follow the same protocol to retreat the second space. And if a unit cannot make a legal retreat, then it is eliminated. So in our example here, the French are obligated to retreat because they lost the battle by 3. So one legal retreat move would be to retreat to Chateau Thierry and then to Cambrai. These are both friendly spaces that are in supply. However, because Sedan is a forest space, then the French do have the option here to take an additional step loss. So for example, this reduced strength corps, they could lose it and not retreat. And in this scenario, the French might want to do that. However, for the sake of continuing the example, let's say the French will accept the retreat and retreat to Chateau Thierry and then Cambrai. Regardless of whether the attacker wins the battle or not, if the defending space is vacated either because the defenders were eliminated or they retreated, then any full-strength attacking units that are still full-strength after the losses can advance after combat into the defending space. Armies and corps can both advance, but only if they're at full strength. If the defenders retreated 2 spaces, then the attacker can advance up to 2 spaces as well into any space that the retreating units moved into or vacated. The advance has to stop, however, if it moves into a swamp, mountain, or forest, and can only advance into a space containing an intact enemy fort if they're legally allowed to besiege it. And again, we'll talk about that later in episode 4. So in our example here, we have a reduced strength German army here. So this army is not eligible for advance after combat. However, other German units, including, for example, the First Army in Koblenz, can advance after combat, and in fact will advance this unit as well. The Third Army will also advance into Sedan. Now, they would normally be able to advance 2, but because they've hit a forest, they have to stop. Both the attacker and defender can play combat cards to affect the outcome of the battle. These can provide die roll modifiers or negate terrain or trench effects. The wrinkle in Paths of Glory is that if you win the battle, you do not discard combat cards that you've played. Instead, they stay in front of you, and you can use them again in any future action rounds during this turn. Now, remember that one action round is 1 action or card play by the Central Powers, and then 1 action or card play by the Allies, so there are 6 action rounds per action phase. Combat cards that hang around are discarded at the end of the entire action phase. Also remember that if both sides dealt the same loss number in the battle, then they both lose, which means they both discard any combat cards that they used in that battle. Resetting our example here, if the attacker is attacking the same defending space and has at least 1 army participating, then he can attempt a flank attack. To do this, the attacker rolls 1 die. If he rolls a 4 or higher, the flank attack is successful, and if not, then it fails. One of the attacking spaces has to be designated as the frontal assault or pinning attacking space. The other participating spaces are flanking spaces. For every flanking space that is not adjacent to enemy units other than the one that they're attacking, there is a +1 die roll modifier on the flank attack check. If the flank attack succeeds, then the attacker rolls for combat before the defender. The combat is no longer simultaneous, so the attacker deals losses before the defender gets to roll. Flank attacks can be risky, though. If the flank attack fails, then the defender rolls first before the attacker. So in our rolling example here, if we declare this initial offensive as a flank attack, then we can declare the space in Liège to be the pinning or frontal assault space, which makes the space in Koblenz and the space in Metz the flanking spaces. Of the flanking spaces, the space here in Metz is adjacent to an additional enemy unit other than the one that it's attacking, so it is not eligible for the +1. However, the unit in Koblenz is not adjacent to any other defending units other than the one it is attacking, so it is eligible for the +1. So in this scenario, we get a +1 to the roll. We need a 4 or better, which means we need a 3, 4, 5, or 6 to make the flank attack succeed. So this means that the flank attack in this scenario has a 66% chance of success, or if I am rolling, it has a 0% chance of success. Section 12.2 of the Paths of Glory rules has the detailed point-to-point sequence of play for combat. Now, I've chosen to describe the mechanics organically instead of going through all this process step by step, but just follow this sequence of play for your first few combats and you will have it down. And let's talk quickly about space control. In general, the last player who has units in a space or moving through a space controls that space, and where necessary, you can mark that with these markers that are provided. The only exception to this is when the space contains an undestroyed fort. The owner of the fort controls the space in that case until such time as the fort is destroyed. So if the French corps here in Belfort is forced to retreat and the German 17th Army advances into that space, and the fort is not destroyed as a result of the combat, then we can mark this space as under siege, and we will mark it with a besieged marker to remind us that we have to deal with that during the siege phase. Again, we'll talk about siege in episode 4. That is a wrap for episode 3. We have covered a lot in this episode, so feel free to rewatch if you need to and take your time. Tune in for next episode, episode 4, where we will cover attrition, supply, siege, reinforcements, replacements, and whatever else I can fit in the time that I have. Be sure to leave any questions or comments below, like the video if you've enjoyed watching this series, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to stick with the program. Thanks for watching.